This is John Drabinsky, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Kesewa John, who teaches in the Department of History at Goldsmiths University in London, England. Her scholarship addresses the complex intersections of diasporic identity, national belonging and non-belonging, and the emergence of England as a multiracial society. In this conversation, we discuss the origins of Black British identity, the relationship between race and diaspora in the Black British imagination, and the complex meaning of Black studies in England in terms of its relation to existing fields of African and Caribbean studies. Good afternoon, Kesewa. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me. How are you today?
Not too bad. I'm really excited about this podcast. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. It's been a difficult last 4 weeks for people here in the U.S., but this podcast generally has been a pleasure and a nice reminder of things that matter. And I'm really excited about this. I was telling you as we were talking before, you're the first person from the UK to talk on the podcast about Black studies. And so I'm really happy about that because it's a perspective that we really need inside this larger conversation. And we're, by the time yours comes out, I think you'll be like 109, 110 in the series. And so it's very late for us to bring the UK into it, but hopefully it will build up, rooted in this moment, a really robust part of the podcast talking across the Atlantic Ocean. So thank you for your time, but thank you also for your thoughtfulness and for making space for this kind of conversation. I appreciate that.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. I'm very kind of drawn into these conversations and I don't always answer them. I'm not always proactive about it, but I do usually enjoy them. So hoping to enjoy it again today.
Yes, well, we will. I will do my best to be make this a good space, and really, this is such an important perspective, and I want to hear how you think about Black studies broadly, and especially in the context of England's sort of history of the field and sort of emergence, and of various kinds of ways it's developed, right? To hear that perspective and how your own work fits inside that history of the field. But really, before we get into talking about Black studies and about your own work, I want to ask you like a more personal question about your intellectual journey. But also, I think it's personal sensibilities journey. I always say intellectual, but I really mean a more personal journey. Like, what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? And for me, always the companion question, like, what sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Well, just start with the small ones, right?
Exactly.
It's a really big question. How did I get into it and what sustains me? I think, like a lot of British people who are Black, finding an absence where our ancestors should be probably is the first way that we found our way into this field. As a historian, I think, I'm not sure if sociologists would say exactly the same thing, or literature people, but certainly for historians, we very much encounter absence in classes at school, absence even at university level often, where Black stories we think should be, or would normally be found. And so that kind of creates a curiosity in and of itself, right? Like, why are we absent? Like, were we never here? Were we not present? And that often was also an absence in the face of our families often sustaining really vibrant histories of our own communities, but also often in the UK, we can trace our ancestry, or if you like, origins really easily to migration stories and other countries. So, for example, I grew up, and I was probably one of the last people in my class at school, in primary school, to have parents that were born abroad. Right, both my parents were born in the Caribbean. That was less and less common as I was coming up, but that was certainly not that uncommon, right? That most people had a parent that was born abroad or a grandparent, and were recent migrants, if you like, into London at the time where I was growing up in the kind of early 90s. And so on the one hand, feeling like we were very drawn to a history of a completely different country from Britain, if you like, but a history that's massively entangled with Britain. So both all of my grandparents and my parents, while being born in Barbados or St. Lucia, were born British citizens. And so I understood Britishness to have been something that wasn't just created in Britain in the way that we understand Britain today, in the borders of the British Isles. So thinking about Black British history, for example, for me, meant exploring the facets of my own history and of those of my ancestors, whether or not they lived in England or not. So my grandparents, on one side, were Windrush migrants. They migrated with that kind of wave of Caribbean migrants in the 50s and 60s into the UK, and lived and died in the UK after that, never went home. On the other side, they did the kind of classic migration story where they came, they stayed for 5 years, but they couldn't go back, wanted to stay for 5 years, couldn't go back after 5 years. And so after 25, 30 years, eventually went home after having built their house, and then never came back to Britain. And so these kind of very different stories, for me, there was something in that in of itself. Like, I guess you asked for a personal story, and it is a personal story, right? Kind of trying to understand what's going on. A lot of my friends now, one of the big conversations we're having is where to bury our grandparents when they die. Do we bury them in England, or they wait on to go home? And is it time to bury them back in the Caribbean or in Africa? And so these questions that we have in our community that we're asking a lot, when someone passes, we have to go back for the funeral, right? So we're very connected to places outside of the UK, whilst being fully present in the UK, right? While having had our childhoods in the UK, having lived most of our adult lives in the UK, while having friends and family and histories that go back decades and generations in the UK, we still have these really strong connections to other places. And that was never reflected for most of us in our schooling, when we think about who was making history, right? And so for us, I think, and I speak for us, and I probably should just speak for myself, but I think it was a very kind of personal, kind of understandable, well, how did this happen? Like, how did the situation that I find myself in now in 2025 come to be? Like, what happened 30 years ago? What happened 40 years ago? What happened 60 years ago? What happened 100 years ago? Like, where is my lineage in the stories of Britain that you're telling me? And that's how I come to Black British history, I think. The other side of it is, I think, as a scholar, that's kind of how I come to Black British history, or history more generally. But I also was a very typical, if you like, mature student, in that I finished my undergraduate degree, and then went off to work and do exciting things, so I thought, and then kind of wandered back into master's study part-time in the evening, and then kind of went off to do other things. And kind of came back to PhD life because I really loved my master's. And when I left my master's degree, I was one of a bazillion Black girl that had a master's degree. There was nothing special in London. But I also got a job on a campus in the Caribbean, where I was teaching English as a second language. And it was in that space, I will always say, I became a scholar. In that space, I was embraced as someone that was curious intellectually, that enjoyed conferences, that kind of wanted to, I was interested in pushing the boundaries of knowledge. I was, all the kind of classic things that make us interested in the life of the mind. I exhibited exactly those traits to my colleagues in the Caribbean in a way that hadn't made me stand out as a student in the UK. And so my intellectual journey really began in lots of ways, or continued to the point where I'm a professionalized historian, through my experience of teaching in the Caribbean. It was my colleagues, first in Martinique, then in Guadeloupe, who really embraced me and taught me about the life of an academic. So I became a scholar in the Caribbean, and that meant it was such a liberating experience I look back on now, because it meant that I was in a space where the study of history wasn't just, for lack of a better word, academic, right? It wasn't just a history because somebody has to study this. These were pressing questions about how the present came to be. I was working in the French Caribbean, and so to even ask questions about local history in that context was to suggest there was a local history that was separate from the history of France. And that in itself was extremely, for lack of that word, radical, but almost treacherous in the eyes of the French state, right? And so the politics of history and whose history we get to study and whose history we don't get to study, and whose histories are marginalized and whose history don't even really exist, what we're allowed to teach in classrooms and what books don't exist, and what sources we can't access and what stories we're not allowed to tell, and discuss with students, and also the hunger of my students, right, to learn things that had previously been denied existed. Like I taught a course on like a local history course, which was essentially for people that worked in the heritage sector, and they wanted a professional qualification. And I came in again, because I was English, as a language tutor essentially. But I was in the history department at that point, and I was teaching this particular kind of, so it was a history course because it was his heritage students, and I was interested in history, and we did a lot of funny things, should we say. And I might have to ask you to edit this because the French government don't like these funny things that we did. But it meant we were exploring local history, right? We were doing nothing particular, when did this happen? When did that happen? Who was that person? One of the things I got my students to do was to ask their grandparents or people that were a generation or two older than them if they knew the name of a particular person who was scandalous in local history, right? But there was like one book that kind of touched upon their role in a particular scandal, but there wasn't a lot written about them, and there still isn't actually. And they came back and they were like, "Oh my God, I asked my grandma, and then they told me this," and they had all this enthusiasm and energy, and I'm taking massive notes because I'm writing about this person in my dissertation, and I cannot find anything, right? And this is, it was, and they came to life, and history suddenly wasn't this kind of really random set of facts that are about nothing that's relevant to them, and suddenly it's about their very own history. It's about the streets that they walk down and the way that the country used to run, and why things are the way they are now. And did you know if you go into this hospital, there's a bust of this person that says that they gave a massive donation to this very hospital that we still think of as a super elite hospital because the history wasn't. I think when you live in the Caribbean, history never is the past, right? It's so present. It's very pregnant with history. You can walk through cane fields. You can walk through anywhere, and the cries of the ancestors are present in your ears. So I became a scholar in that space, and that shapes, I think, the way that I think about not just work and being an intellectual, but the questions I'm asking and who I'm doing this history for. It really shapes how I do Black British history, because I will constantly ask the question, who is this history for? We want to do Black British history, but who is it for? Is this because the white establishment has decided they want to study a more diverse history, or is this because Black people have the right to study their own history? Because those two things these two things are in tension, right? And we need to hear about what we're doing here. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, this is a wonderful reflection. I really, there's so much to think about in that. One of the things that struck me was just, the way, and this comes out has come out in a lot of these podcasts, the way that families, I do mean this in an extended but also community kind of sense, the way that families are an archive, right? Rather than we need an archive, and families maybe say something that's sort of anecdotal that the archive makes into a serious thing. But also not just the sort of stories, as you were saying, that first drew you in, that sort of stories that your own family was telling, but also you said the questions that it raised, right? And so the way that the family is an archive, both in providing the questions and real content. I hate to sound so bland to put it that way, but the questions and content, that's what archives do, right? They raise questions for you. And that the way that is situated in relation to formal institutional erasure.
Yeah.
That something may not be in the local library or the local, university archive, but that there's this other way of approaching these archives and doing history, as histoire, right? As story, as well as the grand narrative, right? So I love that. This was really beautifully put together. It sounded like an historian, honestly. An historian who has a really complicated and interesting way of thinking about what an archive is. And I think in Black studies in the U.S. context, at least, that this idea that communities and families are archival resources is so transformative. And it sounds like that's exactly your own personal journey, but also your time in Martinique and Guadeloupe.
No, absolutely. I mean, like the sources that you could find, and sources in the kind of traditional, if you like, archival sense of the word, right? Like I shudder. I shouldn't have. Okay, I might have to ask you to think this, but like I've got a colleague whose mum was a really important activist, and she's lovely. And I've had a couple of Orange Street interviews with her, and I've been through her photos, which sit in her garage, which is open air in Martinique. And she's just got some boxes. And I every now and again, I'm like, but what if someone comes? Yeah? Like
Mm.
this is like
Yep.
massively important data that tells us something about why Guadeloupe today has chosen the path it has chosen, why different choices weren't made. You've got the Communist Party archives in your garden, really, without even
Wow.
a lock on the door. And at any point, somebody could come and take these. And there are so many elders at the moment that we think about, or that I think about, maybe not everyone's thinking about them, that like have reams of documentation just chilling because they preserved them because they knew they were important. So they have them sitting underneath a desk somewhere, in a box somewhere, in an attic equivalent, right? But we are not able to access them for any number of different reasons. They don't want to leave them in state archives for any number of different reasons. Um, and the stories are just there, not being told when a whole generation is desperate to understand why things are the way they are. Like that's heartbreaking, and it's a thing that I lose a lot of sleep over. That like on the one hand you have these people preserving these stories and the documents that support them or that evidence them, and you've got these young people trying to understand the world that they live in, and these two just don't seem to meet. I think a better scholar than I would figure it out. But I haven't, as so far, been able to. And I think that's true in the French-speaking Caribbean. I see it really clearly there. But it's also true of the UK. Like there are so many stories that we just don't know. Or some people know them. The people that get PhDs don't necessarily know them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that like
The gap.
and the people that are out here teaching Black British history don't know them. But the story's there. The history's there. Like there's so much, and those are the things that we know that are in our time. And so I shudder to think about things that people have kept from generations earlier, right? I mean, we know that, like, the very recent past, the last 50 years of the UK have been massively transformative for both the Black community in the UK, but also for Britain itself, as it has integrated or not, or struggled with or not, this idea of being a multicultural society. But is the perspective of the Black people who made that society always going to be obscured because we don't access their stories? That's the
Hmm.
question I
Hmm.
grapple with a lot. What happens when institutions hire people that are on the surface or according to their criteria excellent researchers, but who don't engage with Black communities or Black elders in any way that's meaningful? Like what kind of history curriculum are we going to produce? And it's a critical time for us in the UK because actually most of the hires in Black British history, for example, were made in the last 5 years. When I say most, I
Interesting.
mean 99.9% recurring. Like I'm trying to think who was the one that was before 2020. And I think there was one who was my predecessor. I think I'm the first person to be the second person in post. Everybody else who's in the
Interesting.
university that's teaching, who is a lecturer in Black British history, is the first to hold that post. Right?
That's such a fascinating phrase, by the way. The first person to be the second person. It's a significant moment, right? It's like this is you're the first person to be the affirmation in one little corner of British academia that says this needs to be studied. Because the first wave, you never know. Sometimes it's the first wave of hires and all goes away, but the second person, that's actually a signature.
Let me I just remember
You
this
could say
one.
one of the first.
I'm definitely one of the first. I think I am the first. I'm relatively confident in that. I'm the first in the single post. So I think the University of Liverpool hired 2 people at the same time. So there's 2 of them.
Hmm.
I'm also one of the first in a department that has more than one. So I was a lecturer in I'm a lecturer in British, and my colleague was also a lecturer in Black British. They've recently changed their job titles, so they're not anymore. But most places have one. And when I say most places, I mean those places that have any have
Yeah.
one. And the ones that they have are also the first to be recruited into that post. Give credit, I don't want to like, some of these are post 2020 hires, but some of these were in the making before 2020 as well,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Um,
But you really raise this question of, what are we doing as, this is relevant for the United States as well, is what are we doing in terms of building, I don't even know quite what the right word would be, but a sort of vernacular, but also centralized archive of Black life, right? That, because in the US, you have, the Schomburg Library, which is part of the New York library system. It's this huge, it's like a mecca for Black studies in terms of of what
we
it
know it.
has
We know
been.
it in the UK. Yeah.
And so, I mean, you just can't get any bigger than that, and it's globally significant. But there's all these questions about what about these other, I think about one of the previous podcasts. I wish I could remember who it was talking about his Black studies professor in Portland, Oregon. So out on the West Coast where, there's really just not much documentation of Black history or Black life in the Northwest. And finding this sort of half-written memoir by an African-American underneath stairs of a house that was getting renovated. And it's like, what is, all of these things, you're talking about as sort of open-air boxes, that hold keystones to so many insights. And that's one of the challenges of, of I think the institutionalization of these kinds of studies of Black life, it comes with that gives you access to these kinds of libraries and these kinds of globally significant things like the Schomburg, opens up all these things. But there's also, where is the space for the sorts of things that you're talking about? That's a real Black studies question I have for sure. So
No, I think also we have in the UK the Black Cultural Archives, which is supposed to be a kind of archive for Black life, so to speak. Despite the name culture, it's kind of all parts of Black life. But even that's kind of reached a critical point where it's closing its doors to the general public, like as of next month. The archives will remain open. I think the event space will remain open to hire. But it's coming into it recently opened its doors in the last, I think, 10 years. I don't think they've been open 10 full years. And yet already at this crisis moment or critical maybe, let me not name things, critical moment where they're changing their way they operate in order to preserve it for self for the future. And this is a national monument that we have, or if not monument, then certainly preservation space, repository. So we're also reaching a critical point in that, with all the energies of 2020 dimming, shall we say, for us in the UK, the question is, what does it look like when institutions are not invested anymore? What does it look like when the institutions that we have are not sure they're going to be able to sustain themselves? What do we have as a field? And that's critical, I think, for Black British history. For Black studies, I think it's a slightly different moment, because I think Black studies has a... So I will happily describe myself as a historian of Black Britain. More comfortable with the idea of a historian of the Caribbean and its diasporas in Europe, including Britain, just because of where my own kind of intellectual trajectory has been. But I think these questions of which archives, which repositories, and how many of them do we own versus do we just live in or rent stuff to, or get housed in, and what don't we get to put in the archives? What stuff are they not accepting?
Yeah.
These questions remain, and they're critical questions for our field, and for the study and preservation of any record that we were here.
Mm-hmm. And let me pick up with that. That was the other thing that stood out to me in your your response to my first question was, you said, the sort of part of what drew you into the study of Black life was this question of, why aren't we there, right? What does it mean for us to be absent, right? And so this is a way of asking about the portrait of Black studies that you work with, right? To sort of, how you think about the field. And I'm thinking in that question of, where are we in history? Where are we in ideas and expressive culture? I mean, this is part of the origins of Black studies in the United States, right? Is in the late 1960s, student protesters said, we have nowhere to study Black life, right? Disciplines don't do it. Black studies will be that place. where all those things that have been erased and forgotten will have a home, right? You develop a tradition, you enrich understanding. But that intellectual sort of moment of the founding of Black Studies, which was about addressing that centuries of erasure, was also a moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where the distinction between politics and its prescriptive dimension and study, that boundary was really broken and merged, right? That the study needed to be about political demands, needed to be about political struggle. And so I think in the US, that's really been the tension around the founding of Black Studies, is addressing these problems of erasure, creating a space where intellectual traditions live and have life and we study, but also the real political demands of Black liberation struggle. So I'm curious how, sort of how you think about the field of Black Studies in terms of its portrait, but also how in a British context that U.S. origin story does or does not resonate.
Fantastic question. Let me do it justice as I try and answer it, please. The origin story of Black Studies in the UK is a little bit different, I think. I think that kind of bottom-up sort of political demands turning into academic disciplines, jobs, spaces to work in institutions. I personally see that more in Caribbean studies. So in the late 70s, you have this kind of push, or in the early 70s rather, to kind of think about how the lives of what would then be called West Indian migrants were not being taken seriously, how the histories were being lost, and how their lives were not. And I don't want to overstate it either, but we needed space to understand them, I suppose is probably what I mean, right? To offer a study that was critical. Sorry, not critical. What's the word I'm looking for? Excuse me, I'm having a blank. We need a serious contemplation of the issues being raised, right? and a space to kind of contemplate them, shall we say? Was kind of, and so you see. So I'm part of the Society for Caribbean Studies. I'm currently the vice chair, and through its understanding that organization's history, I understand that activists as well as scholars were key to the founding of that organization, right? And scholars went into departments and taught Caribbean studies from that perspective, as in looking for solutions, if you like, or using research, if you like, to answer questions that the Black community was asking. And that was understood at that time as a Caribbean community, which is faulty, and we can argue about that, right? It was never a homogenous entire Caribbean community, but that's the way it was understood at the time. And so the Society for Caribbean Studies comes out of that moment. Black Studies, for me, is a much more recent development. So you have studies of, and we also have, because it's an imperial context, right, an imperial country, UK, and so you also have African studies having a really long history, but being very bound up in the British imperial projects, and Orientalist interests as well. So African studies has a slightly different history, if you like, to Caribbean studies in that sense, and arguably we can argue that like Caribbean studies went through a phase of being co-opted by the university, in the broader sense, and kind of them being decolonized, which African studies hasn't gone through. Some people might argue, but I'm not going to argue that point with them. But there's tensions around that, right? That African studies remains kind of not led by African people, should we say? And that's not quite true of Caribbean studies entirely, certainly in terms of the learner societies, I'll say that much. Yeah. So hang on, so Black Studies then is a different beast from these two, right? So you have African studies in the UK, you have Caribbean studies in the UK, and then you have Black British studies. Doesn't really exist until, I think, I would argue, even the 21st century.
Oh,
all right.
Okay.
So it's a much more recent thing. There are always efforts to teach Black history in various spots, but it's quite patchy. A different space perhaps is sociology. So we have the Birmingham School in the early 80s, right, the late 70s, where you have Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, Hazel Carby, Kabina Mercer. So sociologists I think in lots of ways are the other, and probably in lots of ways the home of Black studies in the UK. Perhaps they're the first. Yeah, so you get the Caribbean Studies crowd, and I think the Birmingham School and the kind of spaces that they are near to. Although I've heard it said, and it is kind of hearsay, but arguably borne out by evidence as well, that that's a school of thought that while doing fantastic intellectual interventions is not going to be engaged with political struggle on the ground. It's kind of brilliant work intellectually speaking, but it's not quite. Whereas Caribbean Studies is very concerned in the early years with kind of what's going on the ground. That's less so of that Burnham School, if you like. Oh, I feel like I'm giving an intellectual history of Black people in the UK, and I feel like I'm failing at it.
It's a fantastic history. No, I'm like taking notes.
Okay, great. Because I also want to say this isn't my area of scholarship. This is just kind of my understanding of the world that I inhabit and how it came to be, right? And so yeah, so you have you have a quite well known course at, I think, London Metropolitan University at the turn of the 21st century, led by Haki Mahdi. You've got the Birmingham City University Black Studies program, and that's the first one to really use the name Black Studies, as far as I understand it, and make quite a big splash. But that's 2013, 12, you know. So, and this is what I mean when I say there's a history of studying Black life in the UK that long precedes that, but it's not called Black Studies until very recently, and arguably the wave of Black British historians is the first time you get like a really concerted effort to teach Black anything, right? The other things have been kind of from the scholars and the work that they were doing, whereas the institutions embrace it, I think. Now, I hope my Black geographers siblings are not like, hang on a second, you've forgotten us. I don't know. I'm sorry, maybe Black geography was doing it first. But
this is so interesting to me because it in some ways is like an inversion of what I think is the Black Studies history of the United States, where there was this thing, Black Studies, but it was really largely African American studies. I mean, it would have Pan-African elements, and maybe I'll edit this out of my podcast. But I think a lot of that Pan-African was also a projection of fantasies about Africa and the Caribbean. And Black Europe, to the extent that Black Europe even registered. But it's really African American studies, and that's not a negative. I mean, African American history and culture is globally transformative. But then I think that the field of Black studies has, very slowly and still very much in process trying to come to terms with Caribbean studies and African studies. And it is an open question in this podcast, and Ashley and I have talked about it. Like, how do we think about, about Caribbean studies and African studies in relation to Black studies, right? How do she and I think about it, rooted in our conversations that we're having, but also listening to people who are, Caribbean historians or literary scholars who are just sort of like, yeah, Black studies is sort of a place where I feel like I'm forging a connection, right? Because Black studies has that predate, but you sort of that reverse time. But I think that dynamic is really interesting because it really does bring out the deepest questions of Black studies in the United States, which is what is Black studies is the single most important Black studies question. But if it's a question, it means that it is always going to encounter these moments of difference and these moments of internal critique, internal to the idea of Blackness, right? But also internal to the field because it's transformed by these points of contact. So it's just interesting to hear this sort of reverse, like, engineered dynamic of Black studies coming to try to figure out a space between African studies and Caribbean studies that have a whole different history. They have a whole different history because of the relationship, of course, of England to empire, right?
Absolutely. But also, the other side of some of that is about how Black people in Britain have identified themselves, right? So for like Black Britishness is something that even now, like, many of us are like,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to claim that, right? Like, like I mentioned childhood, and I'll go back to it again, but growing up in London, Like, no, Englishness was very, very, very clearly associated with whiteness. And for those of us who were not white, we were like, I'm not English, I'm British, it's on my passport, I've got the paperwork to prove it. But like, I identified until I was an adult as a person from the Caribbean with this strong English accent that you hear now. And having merely had a few holidays there, like I was, half St. Lucian, half Bajan, that was who I was. And someone said, where are you from? And I'd be like, I'm from the Caribbean. They would say, cool, I'm from Ghana, or I'm from Nigeria, or I'm from Sri Lanka, or wherever they were from. And we would say it. And I, as an adult, I reflect back and I understand that part of that is because we didn't ever query our nationality. We understood we were British. And so that was kind of we were in South London talking like this. We got that we were from London. So the question then was like, so where your family from? And it was never a bad thing. It was a cool, like, so where do your people come from? Right. It was almost a getting to know you in a more personal way. It was kind of a warming thing, like, tell me more about yourself kind of thing, right? It was never supposed to be to make you feel like a foreigner. That's not how I understood it, and that's not how we raised it, and that's not how we used it. But it meant that the scholarship reflects that we identified as being from somewhere else. And so to study Black life was to study Caribbean life, was to study African life. Let's say African because the demographics of the Black British community have changed. So when I was, for a long time, and maybe until the 21st century, it was a majority Caribbean community. And that has shifted now, right? So, which is why the issue with African studies is an interesting one, because that's going to have to change going forward, but it hasn't changed yet, right? But it means that for us, Blackness was associated with being here and to have somewhere else, right? It was never a singular, we're just from here. Like, nobody was just from here. I remember, I can hand on heart tell you, I remember the first time I met someone who didn't know where they were from, and you'd just like, what do you mean you don't know where you're from? Like, I was in sixth form. I was 17, 18 years old. Grew up in a multicultural part of London. I met Black people all the time. I met people from everywhere all the time, right? London's a very cosmopolitan space. And she's like, and it was like, you think it's the first day of sixth form or something, and you knew her, and, hey, where you from? She's like, I'm from here. And I was like, we're all from here, so where your family from? She's like, oh yeah, my parents are from here as well. I was like, oh, okay, so where are your grandparents? Like, where are you from? Like, no one's from here really. Like,
Yeah.
she was like, no, we're like, my grandparents were born here. And I was like, your grandparents were born here? Oh. And she's like, yeah, we don't, like, we're just from here from like forever. And now I'm desperate to know her again and be like, oh, so what's your story? Because at the time I didn't appreciate that was actually really interesting, that you could trace your roots back so far. At the time I just thought it was weird, because no one I knew was like that. Everybody I knew was from somewhere else and could connect their roots and was very proud of their story, and like, that was part of their family lore, that they were from somewhere else, and fascinating places, right? Like, and because of the time that I was growing up, lots of people like, it's only talking to my sister in later years, lots of people were had been persecuted politically, is the right way to describe it, and had like escaped, like, I was friends with like a nephew of like Idi Amin. Like, that was just like, at the time I didn't know that, know who Idi Amin was, right? But in later life, you kind of realize that history was all around us. And that's probably why we were kind of interested in the past as well. Because so many people had a story, somebody's like, I had a friend from school whose parents had been in prison with Nelson Mandela, right? And they'd had to leave South Africa. Like, it was really common to have those kinds of stories, which are massively important for history. But at the time, we're just like another person's story. Like another, like, you have to cut a lot of this. I am really...
No, I'm not cutting any of this. No, but so much of what I'm thinking about as I'm listening to you, and that's why we do this podcast, and we don't just talk to 10 people and that's a portrait of the field. Because one of the things that I'm hearing and hearing you say and come back to is making me think about something I hadn't thought about the relationship between Black studies as a field and the question of roots. Like, where are you from, right? And that's the, as you said, in vernacular, like, where are you from? Well, I know we're from here, but where are you from, right? These moments of like, those are questions of roots that aren't just about you talking with a friend or a classmate, right? It's in some ways negotiating whether or not there's going to be the possibility of Black studies or Caribbean and African studies in the future, right? Or as a thing that that you're drawn to, right? That needs to be in the classroom, that needs to be in the archive, that needs to be in books, that needs to be in classrooms, and all of these things. So I hadn't really ever thought about the problem of not the problem, the question of roots in relation to Black studies, because Black studies in the United States is about African American life, firstly and foremost, which had the, outside of Indigenous people, the oldest roots in North America. So I'm not cutting any of that unless you ask me to, because I think that because it's telling such an important story about an emerging field in the UK, which for me is that's part of what was so interested in, to hear the sense of it emerging and what questions is it answering, or what is it responding to, and what is it different from. And you just put it so well there. I really love that.
Oh, maybe I should stop then. But what I will say is, I think Black studies also reflects the shift from that moment where we were all from somewhere else, and where people have kind of slowly come around to the idea of being Black and British in a way that still, I'm with the generation where I'm still oh, that feels a bit weird. It doesn't sit that great, but it's there. Whereas people much younger than me are really at home with that idea, and I think there's a electoral campaign in the early 80s where the Tories, the Conservative government, have a poster we studied in school. All right, that's how I know I wasn't there. Called they have a picture of a young Black guy in a suit, and it says, to Labour he's Black, to us he's British, right? And and it's.
I have to see that poster. That's like a whole series, a whole book series to be written about. Okay. Wow.
Because for most of us at that period, holding on to you, it's that generation where people are, even if they're born in the UK, they still speak with the strong accents of their parents, of the place that their family is from, because there's a real sense of being from somewhere else. And I think Carol Phillips has talked really nicely about how, for many of us, home also serves as a kind of psychic escape. So while we're kind of struggling on the streets of England, home is a place where we belong, where we're safe. And so I think that's part of the reason why in the Black Imaginary in the UK, it's really, really not weird to hear someone who talks like me sound from Jamaica. And they've never been to Jamaica a day in their life. They have no plans to go to Jamaica, and they may never live a day of their life in Jamaica. But in their heart, their first identification is with Jamaica. Yeah. Right? And so I think Caribbean Studies has reflected that, but Black Studies is reflecting the change that that's less and less common, I think.
Then the imaginary of England as multicultural. I mean, that's, I'm not English, obviously, but that is a proposal that it doesn't have an immediate intuition, right? In the sense of English does have its, as you said, if you think of African studies in England, I do think of this colonial project, right? Which is not related to the actual people on the ground and the students and young faculty or even middle-aged scholars, but that catching that shift, that moment that Black British means something other than this Tory poster, which is pretty terrifying in its own way, but also so massively important. I'm trying to not live write an essay on that. We were talking about Samban before we got on the podcast. I'm like, oh, this is Mandabi is about the suit and belonging. Anyway, well, let me ask you about your research. You've already maybe gotten quite a ways towards talking about this. That your PhD is in history, and you identify as an historian in so many ways, but your work is involved in Black studies and Caribbean studies. And so I'm interested in how that disciplinary training, but then also moving in this other space, which is not disciplinary specific, how that's impacted how you think about your own scholarship, if it has at all, but also even with a classroom, how it changes the way you think and talk about a classroom. We were talking about film before we hit record. When I was thinking to myself, history doesn't prep you to talk about film, but you were like, I've been interested in writing about film. I'm sort of curious how, that that work with Caribbean studies, with Black studies, has changed the way you understand yourself as an intellectual and intellectual work, but also classroom work?
Um, I think that's a really big question, so I'm gonna pause rather than just rush to say something. Um, yeah, I think I've often thought of myself as a different kind of historian for that reason, right? I'm also my master's was in cultural studies, essentially, ethnicity, globalization, culture.
Okay.
And I also studied French at undergrad and have and continued to study French throughout. So I was always a historian, and French for me was much of the time was the Caribbean francophone areas, right? So Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyane, Haiti, Saint Martin. Don't want to forget anyone. Um, and so yeah, I think in terms of but also you've quite rightly point out because the history I studied was Black largely, pretty exclusively really. Um, I kind of live in all these different intellectual spaces. So the Society of Caribbean Studies has been a real intellectual home for me, and that's been really important. But also, as a historian, I've been very much involved in Black British history. Um, my research is shaped by all of those things in that. But I think the interests I have are based on in lots of ways on my understanding of the world that I kind of have inhabited and trying to understand it. And that has led me to my research questions, and that has forced me, I think, in lots of ways to go into these different areas to find answers, is probably how I would say it. So I got really interested when I lived in Martinique between 2012 and 2018 in trying to understand how it was that Martinique and Guadeloupe were so isolated from their English-speaking neighbours, when from Martinique particularly, you can see St. Lucia with your naked eye. You see the lights on the cars, like from the south of in St. Luce, you can see St. Lucia. And in St. Lucia, similarly in Castries, you can see Martinique. It's that close. So how is it, like, we've come to this space where, like, when you travel between them, you feel like you're going between worlds? Like, how, like, what is that? And I was really interested in the period before the departmentalization, 1946, and trying to understand what did, like, the radical imaginary imagine the future or freedom might be before it had come to pass, before departmentalization, before independence, when people were exploring or imagining what possibly a day after colonialism would look like. What did they think? So that was kind of the doctoral research I did. So I ended up looking in, like, newspapers owned by Black people, written for a working class Black public, and how they were responding to the political moments of their day, which was the 1930s, how they understood the German demands for the return of her colonies, how they understood the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, how they understood the labor rebellions themselves that kind of rock the Caribbean and take it to that point where a new day has to come now. But I also was interested in the spaces that women occupied in that radical imaginary. And I was also interested in the Caribbean, but also the connection with the diaspora. All right, what was the link between people in the Caribbean and people in London, in France? And how did those ideas circulate? All right. So that meant that I was, by necessity, crossing, like you say, disciplinary boundaries in ways that I didn't think of that weird at the time. And I thought they were necessary. I wasn't trying to be innovative or clever. I was just trying to do what had to be done to get the answers, if that made sense. I was interested in crossing boundaries. I was bilingual. I am bilingual. You know, I was reading sources in English and French, and I just was trying to make sense of the world that I knew had to have a history. Essentially. So it kind of all came back in some ways to just kind of understanding, if I can be a Black person who has ideas about stuff, and I know my parents were intelligent people and they in their day had ideas about stuff, then it stands to reason that there were other Black people who had ideas about stuff before them. I think is the bottom line of being kind of interested in Black intellectual history as I am.
And that, I think, this is for me what's always been so interesting about Black studies. And a part of, for me, what I like about it is, the I don't know, it authorizes, in the context of academia in the U.S., authorizes engaging with music and cinema and whatever else is interesting. But I think this deeper shift of focus the way you put it, of I had a question, and so certain things come to answer those questions, and that's this moment of that's what I'm interested. I'm interested in the question and what comes to help me respond to those questions, rather than I'm a disciplinary person who, whatever question I have, it has to form according to the kind of methods and what counts as evidence for that particular discipline.
Yeah, I realized I completely skipped over what you said about film. I'll answer the bit about film. So the film thing came about really pragmatically. I was teaching first year undergraduate students in Guadeloupe, and I was teaching them Black British history. And they were speaking English, learning English as a third, fourth, sometimes a fifth language, right? They're speaking French and Creole first, sometimes French first, but one of those two first. Some of them were Spanish speakers, like they're migrant kids, or they might speak another language, right? Just English might be their third language, but it could also be their fourth quite easily. And that was amazing to be in the classroom with them on the one hand, but it meant I had no illusions about their ability to read long text in the way that I might expect native speakers of English. And so I had to find another way for them to kind of both engage with the ideas and have some kind of theoretical work or text work, but some other way to engage. And that's how film came in. So I was finding these really old films, like from the really old. The earliest one we did was 1936, Song of Freedom with Paul Robeson. I used Sapphire, 1959. And what else did we do? I feel like Sapphire, 1959, Song of Freedom, 1936, Babylon, 1980. And so, in circa 2020, these are really old films,
Yeah.
And so that's the 19-year-olds in my class, these are the crazy old films. But the way that they represented Black Britishness, each of them differently, would allow us to have conversations, right? So Song of Freedom stars Paul Robeson. He's got an American accent, inexplicably. He's surrounded by these kind of working class white people. He's supposed to be a docker. It doesn't sound like a seaman that's come from some part of the empire. But there's no problem. And also he's got a wife, a Black woman. I think she's played by Elizabeth Dove, but I don't want to say that wrong. So how is the woman depicted as well? He also has a sidekick character played by an actor who then turns up again in Sapphire playing a really similar minstrelsy type character. Really painful to watch, really awkward depiction. And particularly interesting juxtaposed against Robeson's dignified Black man, right? He's going to sing, to do Robeson, right? And so to have this kind of really offensive depiction of another kind of Black man, it's like, what was that? Like, Robeson had managed to get it into his contract. He wasn't going to play that character, but the film was going to but we have to have someone like that. Like we could have that conversation kids with the students. And then Sapphire is the story about passing in London, or in England rather, because the movement between Birmingham and London is part of the passing story. And it's designed as this kind of socially conscious film. Socially conscious, is that the word? This kind of social problem film. It's kind of a genre in Britain at that time. And then the way that I'll discuss them is, and then Babylon is the only one that's, I think, written direct. No, it's Franco Rosso's. It's actually made by Italian as well. So none of these films are directed by Black people, but they're touching on Black themes. So we're talking about authorship. What does it mean? How do we feel about them? What do they tell us about Britain? And how do we have that conversation in the context where these students are not British, right? So how do you see Britain? How does this compare to the depictions of Britain as you've seen up until this point? Is this do these feel authentically Black to you? Because that's something that you can either identify with or not, right? Either you feel like this feels like it's off or it's not, right? So we had some really great conversations, and these are juxtaposed with it's a part of a course. There's 10 weeks, there's other things happening as well. But I found film really effective. They kind of got things really quickly. They could, the subtlety, in this day and age, people are really skilled at reading film without much training, actually. And so to compare them across time periods, is sort of 20 years apart, each of these films. allowed us to, and that's how I kind of got interested in using films, because actually this is a really useful way of thinking about the past without, in a way that's accessible to these students in particular, but actually other students will benefit from this as well.
Did you foreground it with the racial identity of the directors? I ask because one of my favorite things to do in courses is for students to watch The Harder They Come. And for so many of my West Indian students, they're just like, yes, I love this. This feels like Jamaica. And was fine. But then to find out it was a white director, they actually had a student a couple years ago, he, borderline cursed me out in a way that a polite student will, but he was like, I feel really betrayed by that film.
Actually, I didn't, to be honest.
It raises questions for the students about, like, what is the relationship between the director and the film, but also, how can you tell stories that aren't bound to the storyteller, but also are, blah, blah, blah.
No. First, we didn't do the film director. I think another film we did was The Island and the Sun with Dorothy Dandridge and, I'm going to get his name wrong. I'm not Harry Belafonte.
Yeah.
We are not the main characters, but they're the main characters for the bit I focus on. So a depiction of the Caribbean from a long time ago. How does it look different? Is it different, the depiction of itself? When it's just the landscapes and the beauty. So I think for students that were trying to understand the past, of the Black past, like thinking about film helped them think about the depictions or the representations they're accustomed to. And seeing if they belong to a longer trajectory of depictions, or if depictions have shifted, right? So one of the things that Sapphire and Song of Freedom, both of them found that, like, Black people appear really dignified, but by the time we get to Babylon in 1980, there's kind of a clear sense that, like, was it Black abjection? Somebody used that expression. There's the abject subject, like, Blackness is definitely with poverty and unhappiness, and that's the world in which they inhabit, and we're just going to look at that more closely here, and trying to give it a bit more of a human face. But actually has that, and so we had some really good conversations. I feel like I really shouldn't talk too much about a course that I taught 5 years ago. It's a little bit risky.
No, but it has it's part of how we think about accessing the past, I think, in a Black studies context, about thinking about, for lack of a better way of putting it, about the way the question of media is an open question rather than a restricted question. Yeah. So maybe this is related to, last couple questions, but the first of the last two questions, what do you think? It's a different kind of history, as you've articulated, in terms of Black studies being really recent and African studies, Caribbean studies being their predecessors or sort of companion projects with a longer history. But I'm interested in it's been 5+ decades in the United States and over, however many years in the UK of building this field of Black studies. What you think has been done well, but also what you think has not been done particularly well?
So I think what has been done well is, I think we've now made the case, particularly for Black British history, that Britain has a Black history that it must attend to and cannot escape attending to anymore. And that's a massive win, right? I'm not that old. Yeah. When I was at school, and this is still the case for a lot of kids at school today, Black history was slavery and US civil rights movement. And that was the extent of Black British history. That's changing very slowly, and some places have a little bit more. Often the Bristol bus boycott comes up because it looks a lot like the US civil rights movement, so it's like that, but different.
Sorry about our imperialism. It's everywhere.
That's for Britain to, we can talk about how I did a history course which chronologically went through British history from like the 1500s. Did slavery, did Caribbean slavery. When slavery was abolished, we skipped over, we didn't do anything else. There were no more Black people in British history and then we came back to the 20th century. It was like, we're going to come back again. And then we did the Windrush, and then we did the civil rights movement. And that was, this is a really terrible narrative that we have. So to say that, like, nah, that's not enough anymore. Like, we need to take this seriously and do it properly. And there's more to this story than we've previously believed to be true, or been led to believe to be true, or been told was true. I think that's a really big win. I don't think we should underestimate that. I think having the Windrush as some sort of origin myth for multicultural Britain has been useful in some ways, problematic in many others. Problematic in that it really obscures the African presence, which was here at the same time as the Caribbean presence, right? So that is really problematic in that sense. Really problematic in that sense. But very, and also obscures any earlier histories. It kind of makes Black people a phenomenon of the 20th century. But I think at this stage where we have a whole tube line named after the Windrush, I feel like we've arrived. You know, you know, like it's less a question that there's a history, and that I think is not to be sniffed at. What have we not done so well? I think is collaborated. If I'm totally honest, I think we've got a lot of different people building organizations in silos, and I think my dad always says, you know, when Black people work together, things happen, and I think we haven't quite in the UK got a habit and a track record of collaborating on a big scale. Like lots of little people collaborate, lots of smaller collaborations happen. Absolutely not saying no one ever works with anyone, but I think we haven't got organized, and I hope we can get organized before it's too late, because I think someone else said, I think it was Vincent Brown on his podcast, said, you know, the institutions will not defend us. You know, I'm the second in post. You know, like this is a fragile, precarious time. And we are not, many of us are newer scholars as well. Very few of us have been in the academy for 20 years. So we're also very junior, a lot of us, especially the historians. That's not true of all fields and all Black scholars everywhere. But like for those of us in this field, which is so kind of, and it's a strange time as well, because as Britain, in the popular imaginary, if you like, comes to the point of accepting that there is a Black history of Britain, the university retracts. And it's like, but not in this classroom and not in this institute.
Interesting, yeah.
So it's kind of a weird time, because like we get, I'm sure my colleagues in other institutions say the same thing, we get, and many of them will get more requests from playwrights and artists and producers of TV shows to consult, because there's a hunger there. The TV stations are showing Black Britain, Black histories of Britain, but the institutions, the universities are much, much slower. It's a very strange time, because we know that most people are going to come to their academic interest a lot of the time through what they saw on TV once or what they read in a book once, right? That kind of stimulates people's thinking. And so the demand's going to come back to the classroom, but we're going to be on the back foot again. And it's such a crazy situation. And I don't know if university leaders are thinking enough about that. Like, you could be on the back foot or you could be on the front foot. This is a choice you make, you know? Yeah. And often, at some of the institutions, like my institution is one of the ones that has been on the front foot, right? It was the first to produce a whole master's program dedicated to the study of Black British history, which is how I mean my job. But it has not always understood. I think they get it as a brand, and the value of it sort of intellectually, if you like, no pun intended. But like the idea of resourcing it adequately, and ensuring that it's well taken care of, and that even from a really sort of base neoliberal position, like that you maintain your market leadership position, like not even there, you know, are we really protecting this? So it's a strange time. And
I mean, this question of like collaboration, playing offense, defense, I mean, it's been a theme in a number of podcasts, and it's a thing I think about constantly, even in the United States, which with a lot longer history of Black studies. But that moment of like, if we can't even play defense very well, how could we ever play offense, right?
Absolutely.
But also what you're saying there at the end, I mean, I struggle with this a lot. In the position, the department that I am in here at University of Maryland, I think that for the university, we're a really interesting mascot. But are we understood as the star player that we actually are? right? Because star players, just to use your neoliberal sort of framing of it, they get a salary, right? The mascot that's a second job for the mascot, right? But a key player, that's a real salary, that's real funding, that's real support, and yeah, boy, if y'all figure out how to make that make that happen, let us know. But also makes this question of, what does it mean to have not collaborated across the North Atlantic around Black studies? I think that's a real question. So maybe
Vacancy.
that we haven't figured out ways to collaborate and program build across the North Atlantic, right? Across England and the US. I think this may be a question to come out of this podcast for me about, that's something that's addressable, because there's wisdom and insight to be gained on both sides. So.
Yeah, I'd like to think that we also need to, I think from the UK perspective, we have to be really careful not to only collaborate across the Atlantic and North America, right? Because if we have a really vibrant Caribbean studies world in the UK that has supported Black scholars historically, then I think we owe something to the Caribbean as well. And if we know that we've got constituents and students who are interested in understanding Africa, and we have a continent full of universities and brilliant scholars, then we have to be better with collaborating that way as well. It has to be thinking that I don't know, for me, I always come back to this question, well, who is this work for, right? And if we've got young Black people who want to learn their history, their culture, their literature, and we have universities that have people employed to teach, then and we believe in student choice in any way, shape or form, right? And we believe that students are customer in any way, shape or form, even if we don't actually like that idea because we're not into that neoliberal marketization of education stuff. But if that is the one little bit that we can use in our favor to say, hang on a second, are we delivering what people are asking us for? If there's a move to decolonize education in our curriculums, right? Then actively collaborating with the Global South has to be something that we do better.
And I could not agree more. And I think you used the word that it was coming to mind as you were talking, which is decolonize, which the question of how to decolonize your universities has been a question in the Caribbean and in Africa for a very long time. And it's not just been a question that some academics are asking on the margins of the university. It's been the entire nation building project has been this question. And the idea that we wouldn't actually gain some wisdom from that is a kind of perverse imperialism, actually. So
absolutely.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this last question, and maybe you've already answered it in part right there, which is thinking about an institutional perspective around Black studies. What is the issue that you would want us to be thinking about, or the question that you would want us to be asking?
For me, it always comes back to who is the work for? And so I think that's one question that I always I harass myself with it, right? When I'm planning a course, I'm like, who is this course designed for? Who is my ideal student? Who is the student that I'm trying to serve their intellectual or meet their intellectual needs, right? But also, I think in this kind of what I think is a really critical moment for Black British history, how do we, on the one hand, destroy the Windrush origin myth, and on the other, give to Black people who have leaned on it as an explanation for how they belong to this country an alternative? How do we ensure that we can teach Black British history for years and years and years and decades to come, as long as there are universities, that we have a space in them, that students can come to university and they can learn Black history? But how do we also ensure that the academy does not gentrify that history to the extent that people that don't come into these doors don't get to learn it anymore? In Black British history, we have a field that was built outside of the academy. We started teaching it inside institutions in the 21st century, but we started writing it back in the 50s and 60s in the Black Parents movement and the supplementary schools movement, right? So we have a long history of producing and recording and writing Black histories. And those people that have been doing that work outside of paid employment in comfortable positions for a really long time, how do they get a piece of the new pie? How do they get reward? And I don't just mean a credit in an acknowledgement because I used your archive. I mean, how do they get to see that that work has paid off for them as materially as it has for those of us who now work in institutions? Right? I think, how do we make sure that our colleagues who are Johnny come latelys to Black British history or any interest in Black life don't take up all the space that means that those elders get pushed out. And the stories that we tell will be marked by where our priorities lie. Right? And I think at this moment, we're designing those curriculums that are going to be used until someone else edits them. Right? Remember, I said all the firsts or the seconds. Right? We are shaping the national Black British story as we speak. That it's such a heavy burden to bear, right? To know that you have to get this right. Because afterwards, everyone's going to be coming to correct you, and it might take a while for that to go through. So it has to be right first time, or as close to right as you can get it, right? You cannot mess this up. So how do we make sure we get it right? And not just get the curriculum right for the students, but do right by the elders, by the community activists, by the people that did the work to get us to this point. I think that's the thing that I lose a bit of sleep over. Like, I don't have any big answers, but I think those are questions that we need to make sure we're asking.
I love that as a place to conclude. That's such a deep ethical imperative that I think anybody listening, no matter what their work is, no matter where they're working, that's really just a deeply relevant question. And as you articulated it, across this podcast, but really built to that moment, it's such an intense burden to get it right, or at least to get it right enough to be revised in a productive way rather than a save the field sort of way. But being aware of the depths of our ethical commitments, I think this is one of the things that's not unique to Black studies, but as a foundational feature of Black studies. That is an intense burden, but it's also something really beautiful when one is committed to it, because it really is about a connection to human life that expands to the past, but also in really profound ways to the future. So thank you for that. I love that as a way to end. And, I was looking forward to this conversation. This has just been fantastic. Like, I'm so happy to have you on the series. And there's so much to think about from this. So I appreciate your thoughtfulness as well as your time and everything you've given me and anyone who listens in. So much to think about. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a real pleasure. I hope I didn't over time talk.
There's no overtime. There's no time limit on the podcast. So
no,
you are nowhere near the longest. So
great. No, it's a real I dabble and dibble in Black studies. I get myself in Caribbean studies and Black studies. I'm not always as confident or sure of my footing, shall we say, because it's not, I think, how I first came into academia, and I'm really glad to be a part of these conversations. A very esteemed company. Much appreciated for the invitation.
Well, it's an excellent contribution to the series. I'm really thankful for that. So, well, have a great rest of your day, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care.
Bye.